I'd like to say is our resident counsellor, a friend, a therapist, someone who I respect deeply, who's joining us today to help us to have that difficult conversation, to think about how we're feeling, to do some sort of self-assessment, that evaluation, to be able to identify some of our feelings, what's going on, why are we feeling the way we are. And, you know, I'm going to let her explain a bit more about what we're going to be talking about, because she's the consummate expert. And if she could, she would hit me. But you know what? When she comes on, you're going to know that I'm telling the truth. Fiona Reynolds, good morning to you, Fiona. How are you this morning?
Good morning, Mike. Good morning, all. I am
Good
well. Giving
morning.
thanks.
I can just about hear you, Fiona.
Okay.
It could be my setup. Can everyone else hear Fiona okay? It's a bit quiet, Fiona.
Okay.
There you go.
Not
That's
sure.
better.
Is that better? Oh,
Yes.
brilliant. Okay, great. I'm
Excellent.
well. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. It's good to see you. Fiona, today, as you know, we want to talk a bit more about grief, loss and bereavement. And you've been on the CAF a number of times before. And this topic, we always seem to just scratch the surface of such a delicate subject matter. And obviously during this time of coronavirus, I think the concept of bereavement and grief has been exacerbated. There are people on this cafe who have lost loved ones, but then there's so many other things that are associated to the subject matter. So Fiona, as I introduce you to everyone, will you be just kind enough to tell us a little bit about yourself for those of you who don't know you, and then tell us what grief, loss and bereavement is, please.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate as always, being given the platform. And primarily because one of I consider it my mission to educate people, to provide knowledge around a topic that is so often avoided, yet so unavoidable. It permeates our lives in every way. A bit about myself. I was trained as a counseling psychologist more than 10 years ago, but for the last 6 years, I have been specifically focused on loss and bereavement, and kind of developed it as a specialist area, primarily because I don't believe people know enough about it, and I don't believe the resources are covering all of the bases that need to be covered. Not that I on my own can do so, which is why I believe that education is key, because the more you know about the topic, it's not even a topic, the more you know about this area of life, the better able you are as an individual to cope with it for yourself and for others. So along with having a private practice, which I started in 2019, and that practice was built primarily to accommodate the cultural nuances that exist among Black, African, and Asian communities. I also do volunteer work with a national bereavement agency, and I do community work with a community project that was set up specifically to encourage talk around end of life, dying, and death and bereavement. So as I said, I choose every platform that I can, every opportunity that I can to just speak out about loss and grief and bereavement and how it impacts on life in general. Yeah. So to the main topic, loss comes in many forms. Most people, when you talk about loss, they automatically jump to death. But you have an uncountable number of ways where you can suffer a loss. Talking about divorce, loss of a relationship, or the end of a relationship, moving home. Young children have a special attachment to their homes that they grew up in, not ever seeing it again as an adult, but the memories are still there. That's a huge loss for them that never ever gets accounted for. Their childhood friends, their school friends, moving away means that they've lost those connections, and those are the people that know the essence of who you are as a child. Because as you grow up, you wear different faces, get covered with different layers, and you change. So not you sometimes lose connection, if not the essence, but you lose connection with who you are. And who you are goes back to childhood. And when that connection is broken, then we can get cast adrift very easily. And I'm going to expand on that quite a bit more, because that has a lot to do with loss of self-esteem and loss of confidence. So yes, explaining about different types of losses is, if we don't acknowledge our loss, then we're not acknowledging the grief that is initiated automatically. We have no control over it. We don't recognize it, we don't acknowledge it, but it happens without us knowing. So the key response to that is to begin to acknowledge your losses, all of your losses. Because in acknowledging that loss, that leads you on to the grief element. And grief is all about emotions. Grief is, as I said, the instinctive response to any loss. And in grief, you will experience a variety of emotions all at once, sometimes one at a time. The key ones, and these are the ones most people can immediately recognize, are anger, denial, frustration, depression or despondency, which is great sadness, and bargaining, as in you want to change the story, you want to find a way to make things different. And I'm sure some of you can relate to that, even in a relationship, in a breakdown of a friendship or even an intimate relationship. You kind of want things to be different for you. So you find ways to make that change happen, but the story remains the same, unfortunately. But we don't acknowledge the grief of that. We feel the pain and we think the solution is to fix the pain. And that is one mistake that is often repeated in our lives and in other people's lives, that we think we can fix grief, but grief has to be lived through. And in living through grief, living with grief, growing around grief, we understand the greater aspect of bereavement. And bereavement is the adjustment that we make layer by layer to develop that understanding, that deeper understanding of how our losses have affected us. So if we look at the really big one, death. Somebody dies, you experience that as a loss, you recognize that you're crying, you're upset, and you now need to shape your life differently because that person that meant so much is no longer here. And you grieve for that. As time goes by, however, the grief broadens into bereavement because bit by bit you start recognizing all of these areas of your life that this person filled, that this person touched, that you invested in with this person, and they're no longer here. So that becomes a greater awareness beyond the initial grief, and you start experiencing what is called bereavement, the all-encompassing knowledge that that is revealed on a daily basis. For some people, for others, it takes anniversaries or specific events to recognize it. And this is why we say grief is not time limited, grief is for life. Because grief becomes bereavement, and becomes bereavement because you learn and adjust and live to grow around the nugget of grief that belongs to that particular loss. So I just want to say, feel free to put any questions in the chat. I'm sure Mike or the team will alert me if there's anything that needs answering straight away.
That's a brilliant introduction, Fiona.
I want to make sure that I am explaining.
Sorry, please go ahead.
No, that's okay.
I was saying that's such a brilliant introduction and a reminder for those who've heard it before. But I mean, today I really want to look at the all-encompassing scope of the titles, the grief, the loss, the bereavement. And I appreciate how you've mentioned it could be moving home. It could be something very, 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 what appears to be subtle, but can affect us in a way that we're not even sure why we're behaving a particular way, why our attitude is a particular thing. But what we're going to try and do today is, I think you used the word to identify, to highlight, to recognize the loss, to count it, to acknowledge it. And so I've got a few questions first for you, Fiona. And you mentioned even young children moving home, that there's an attachment, there's an emotion, it could be the family home they were raised in, and then to be moved, it feels strange going into a new space. Can resilience to grief be taught to young children? Or can grief just knock you by the side of your head and discombobulate us in a way that we cannot prepare for it? Is there something we can do to teach us to be a bit more resilient?
Powerful question, Mike. So each loss that we experience is experienced differently, and the grief that follows is going to be related to that particular loss. And that happens for a number of different reasons. This type of loss, it's the way that loss has happened. And as much as preparation can help, for example, if it's something tangible like moving a house, you can include, if it's children, if we look at it from the perspective of children, can prepare children in advance, be open with them, communicate, and to some extent include them in the change, in the move. Sorry, it does help to some extent,
okay,
but not completely, because grief will knock you sideways, however much preparation you have. There's no way you can anticipate how you are going to grieve until you have experienced that particular loss. And what makes this particularly important is that there is this thing called anticipatory grief, where people in times of illness will grieve the loss of the loved one as they see them decline. And in themselves, they're also grieving ahead of time for their own loss of that relationship. But when the loss itself happens, then they're not back and don't understand, because they thought they had grieved and they thought they had prepared for it. But that is the impact of loss. The welter of emotions will come, and they will come all at once, and they will come and confuse you and turn you inside out, upside down, tear you apart. And as resilient as you may have been before, it can knock it out of you. Where resilience comes into play is, if you were a resilient person before, it means you have coping mechanisms in place. It means you can identify, you can apply these coping skills that you have developed over time, and you can work your way forward from the point you were knocked back. if we consider how young children develop, sorry, before I go there, grief, I have to say, grief is a process of change, and resilience is what helps you cope with change, right? It helps you manage change. That if we consider young children who are, I have to say, culturally speaking, we don't communicate historically, perhaps we're better now, but we never really communicated well with children. So we did what we did as adults, and children were just, told to follow along, be quiet, do as you're told. Adults are talking, adults are in charge, let's go. So they're not involved in any way. They just know that they've lost what they had. How that will impact on a child, as a child, will leave them with a sense of insecurity. It will leave them with a loss of self-esteem. It will leave them with a lack of confidence, because their world has been shaken. The adults just don't realize it. And as much as they do adjust, because they have to, because they are growing and developing in their own way, in spite of everything else. And when it comes now to experiencing their own losses as adults, that inability to understand change and to adjust, prepare, and to develop those coping skills that come with preparation from a very young child, that is carried forward as the inner child into adulthood. So when we are knocked flat as adults, we automatically revert to our inner child. It's not a conscious thing. It is just our most vulnerable parts come out. And if that inner child has not healed, if that inner child was not developed adequately with the skills and the tools that provide us the resilience we need as adults, then we remain injured. And we continue to nurture that inner child and feed that inner child with inappropriate coping mechanisms. And that leads us down the path, a spiral of hurt, continuing hurting ourselves and then hurting others around us, unable to cope from day to day, unable to deal with what we are facing. And that would be the loss and the grief and life in general, the changes that are happening around us. And as I say, these inappropriate coping mechanisms just feed on themselves and continue to spiral downward until you come to a point where you can't go any further. And usually that's when people turn to the professionals and seek help. And the process of going backwards to come forwards begins. So it makes, the process does happen, but there's just that much more of a mountain to climb if we are not given the ability to recoup from young children.
Wow. That's Fiona, you've got my mind churning and thinking in multiple dimensions at the moment. Wow. The role of a parent is so difficult. It's such a challenging role because we may be allowing grief to manifest in our children completely unaware of it. We're not deliberately doing something, but because of protocol or culture or ideologies or preferences, we think their brains are too small or they're too young to understand, and we don't necessarily carry forward with a sympathetic approach to what's going on in their world. And I've tried to explain that to some parents recently who may not be completely cognizant of the grief that young children are going through today. And that's not necessarily, as you said, because of a death, but it's the loss of their social life. Whether it be to go to the park and play with a bunch of friends, to kick a football around, or to play tennis, or to go to the cinema, to go ballet, to sleepovers, whatever. They've lost that interaction. And I heard last week of an 11-year-old who committed suicide. It's horrific. So that was grief upon grief upon grief upon grief. And it's not enough for us to just simply say to our children, oh, you'll be fine. It's not enough. So Fiona, I'm going to ask you if you could just explain the different cycles of grief, just for us to get a perspective that we may be able to then start to identify our losses and to name them, to own them, and to correct them before they change us completely.
Well, it is difficult to pinpoint specific cycles because grief takes its own path. However, it is important to acknowledge, above everything else, to acknowledge the fact that there is grief present, and that there is a valid reason to grieve. Often in my work, I come across people who literally did not have permission to grieve. And once they've received that permission, the doors open wide and everything comes out. And that is their turning point. All they needed was that level of acknowledgement that they didn't have to grieve in a special way. They didn't have to grieve, hide their grief, that they were entitled to their grief. And giving themselves the permission to release that meant that they could turn the corner. And what will happen though is, I think I'm trying not to be too specific, but then it's hard. But certainly when with significant losses, and I use that advisedly because different things would be significant to different people for different reasons. But if you suffer the significant loss, immediately your brain freezes pretty much. You will find it difficult to focus. You find it hard to concentrate. You will operate, you will be functional, but you will not be engaging. You will not be yourself, plainly put. And some people find it so hard to come to grips with not being themselves in a very, very upsetting situation, that they force themselves to be themselves, and that in itself can be very, very damaging and can add trauma into what is quite possibly devastating, but not necessarily traumatic. So that's one of the first things that will happen, and it will take time for you to settle within yourself, for your brain to unfreeze, quite literally, and start to come back to itself. And that's when you really need to be patient with yourself, to be kind to yourself, to look after yourself, eat well, sleep well, keep positive, as in good people that you know you and know what you need and know how to look after you. Keep those kind of people around. Don't feel obligated to, open your doors to any and everybody. Fortunately, right now it's difficult to do that. But also, unfortunately, you don't have the people around you that you would like to have. That's why the tradition of gathering after a funeral is so important, because you get that level of support that's supposed to carry on, but it doesn't. There are a lot of unfortunates in grief, mainly because we're not educated, and because of cultural practices and beliefs.
Wow.
So you get through the practicalities of what needs to happen immediately after the loss, and then you have to begin the process of adjusting your life around your loss. So let's stick with death. If we've lost a husband or a partner, I should say, and that partner held specific roles, there will be times when you will very abruptly recognize this great big gaping hole in your life where this person did things that you didn't have to concern yourself with. So that period of adjustment, of catching up almost, has to happen, which is why you need to take time with your mind, because your mind isn't really working right. Um, what 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 this process is called is the beginning of restoration. So when you are immediately suffer a loss, you're all about the grief, all about the sadness, all about coping with the immediacy of what that loss means. But in terms of practicalities, because a lot of the time your emotions have to be put on hold so you can function. Then your emotions start to get released. And as they get released, you are at that time now looking to begin picking up the pieces of your life. So there is a theory called the dual process model,
Sorry,
which,
Fiona, can I just quickly jump in there? You're talking about the emotions getting released, but they could be quote unquote out of control. They could be eruptive and anger and all other types of emotions just releasing out because we're recovering from that brain freeze.
yeah,
So is that normal for
yes,
people who've experienced grief to be sometimes angry and frustrated and annoyed and guilty?
absolutely. And guilt and anger are the two strongest emotions that will be experienced in grief, and sometimes become the focus of the grief, because it means that, they feel they have a sense of control. The griever feels they have a sense of control. But you're absolutely right, Mike, that everything seems out of control, especially your emotions.
Thank you.
The anger, the ones that I spoke of before, the anger and the need to bargain, to change the story, the frustration, the extreme sadness, and the sense of denial, that this can't be happening, this isn't real. All of these things can happen at the same time. You can hit one after the other, get hit one after the other with each one of these emotions, and unable to process them, and just be in a state of confusion, in a dark place very often. Or you can have them one at a time. You can have there's no order to them. You can be angry and chase everybody away because they bought the wrong milk for you, you know and your husband would have known the right milk, and that is your outlet to release that sense of loss just there. Or you could be angry with the world. Look at them, they're carrying on with their life. You look out the window and you see people passing by, and it just like gets to you. How could they? Don't they know your world has changed? Don't they know that everything is different? Don't they know what this means? You feel, yeah, just rage at the world.
So,
And
Fiona, sorry
these
to
are
cut you
hard to
again.
control.
I told you my mind's all over the place now. It's, as someone once said, scrambled eggs. My mind's everywhere. But so it sounds to me that whilst there appears to be severity of issues from the child moving home at 5 years old, which we might think it's come on, brush yourself down with good, right the way through to sudden death. However, for a 16-year-old who's lost their first partner, girlfriend, or whatever, that level of grief can have
Wow.
such a traumatic effect
Yeah.
going forward into their relationships. And so we have to be very tender and careful to not necessarily observe someone's grieving behavior and rank it, because to them is the critical thing. It's
Yeah.
the critical thing. And someone's asked a question here, Fiona, about the jobs. You've been in a particular job for 20 years
Yeah.
and then there's entrenchment, there's reduction in, because of coronavirus, restaurant business, theatre businesses, so many industries are shutting down, and then they give you the bad news that you've got to go. That's grief. that causes trauma. And if it's happened to you previously, then you could start self-sabotaging. You could thought, well, it must have been me, something I'd done, and the emotions come out. I'm going to ask you a big question, Fiona. How does someone manage emotions in this difficult season? What can we do once let's say whilst we've been talking, you've identified a loss or some episodes of grief, or you've identified the trauma. What can we do to start that recovery, that restitution process?
Okay. You touched on possibly three big areas there at the same time, Mike.
I told you my mind's all over the place. Sorry. Please go ahead, Fiona.
Yeah. Well, okay, I'm going to deal with the young adults first, because that's one of my favorite little touchy-feely areas. It is such a confusing time ordinarily for young adults, teenagers, older teenagers, even up to 25. Such a really confusing time because of hormones, because of their view of the world, and their disenchantment with authority and the establishments that exist. And for many of them, they find what they call security in their peer groups. And a lot of what happens in peer groups is mirroring. They mirror behavior, they mirror dress codes, they mirror likes and dislikes. When they're involved in a relationship, as we know, as adults, we don't get it right very often. We don't get it right for ourselves, and we don't get it right for the other person. And that's primarily because we go into the relationships not knowing ourselves. So imagine we as adults having that level of confusion, what it is like for a teenager who is, discovering. And while they're discovering, they're exploring themselves and the other person, and it is a minefield. Then you find a level of stability with a relationship with a person, and then this person, either the relationship breaks down, or, as is happening now, the person dies. What does this young person do? They turn to the ones that they know can give them comfort, but they don't know how to ask for comfort because they've already rejected the idea of who these people are, the authority figures, their parents, the establishment. But they need that comfort. And really and truly, what we fail to do is recognize that in the midst of the building of barriers, it's a cry for, I want you to see me, I want you to know me. And what we need to be more capable of doing as adults, as parents, and as all forms of caregivers, is to recognize that we never stop being that shelter for our young people. And we can't shape how we offer that shelter because they themselves are still trying to understand who they are and how to approach us. So in times of loss, the best thing, the most stable way of supporting a young person is being available. Just being open and receptive to them and allowing them to speak whatever they have to speak, whenever they need to speak it, in the way that they choose to speak it. And that takes a lot from us to let go of a lot of different, ideas and frameworks that we hold dear. But that is really what matters most to the young people. In terms of the other scenarios you were describing, we're considering loss of confidence, loss of worth, loss of a sense of value. Particularly, we attach so much value to the jobs that we do, to the impact that we have within an organization, because we are known, not necessarily as individuals, we're only known for what we can produce. And when we lose the ability to produce, we lose the place where we can produce, then We doubt who we are. We doubt we have any form or shape outside of that particular um, framework that we've given ourselves. But it's a false belief, because we go as individuals and we operate as individuals, and that's really what we need to hold on to, that we are an individual. But if we go back to the origins, our origins, many of us are wounded children. So having again suffered such a deep loss as the loss of a job, the loss of options. Even in COVID, we lost the ability to choose. We don't have a choice about what's happening right now, and that's hit us very, very, very hard, and we're not coping well with it. Finding all different ways of employing, you know, different mechanisms to manage the situation that we're in. But what we need to hold on is our sense of self. We need to hold on to our sense of self, as in discover, it's wise to use that opportunity to delve deep in and examine those wounds and those hurts, and explore who we really are, what we really want. I've many times said the benefit of this whole pandemic is it is very revelationary in more than one way. We have been separated from what we believed that we value, what we believed we hold dear, what we believed had worth to us. And it's been over a year now. If those things still have value for you and you've identified that, that's all well and good. There's a reason for that. If you can't even picture yourself doing any of the stuff that you're going for, any of those old habits or old ties, then clearly it didn't have value. So reassess where you are at. This is the beginning of resilience. You're looking at what was, considering what you have now, and reassessing how you can operate within the new framework that you've been offered, that you are living in. And if we look at COVID, we have lost so much. COVID times, we have lost so much. So if you are not reassessing, then there is something that's blocking you from doing so. And it's worth examining why you're not reassessing, why you're holding on to what was, because the change has happened. The separation has caused that change. That loss has created that separation. You're grieving for it, absolutely. But in grief, you should be adjusting, you should be changing, because grief is a time of change. If you're not changing, you're stuck in that place where you've had a loss, but you're not acknowledging it, you're not recognizing it. Therefore, you are not beginning the process to build up your resources that you already have. We all have these resources. We just need to recognize what they are. Sometimes we need help to recognize them.
And that's so important, Fiona, because as we're doing that reassessment, that's probably sometimes when we need that coach, that support, that the supporting narrative to help you activate your choice.
Right, that's a good word.
Yeah, we kind of know what we should do, but then we don't necessarily do it because it feels like I'm already gone through such a difficult change. If I activate the very thing that I want now, that's another change. And I don't know if I can manage. And I sense that's where a lot of people are, especially when things outside of their control is happening to us. E.g. lockdown, isolation, COVID is happening to us and through us. And it's a very difficult, very, very, very difficult situation. Fiona, I've got a question. It's come from our good friend Sabrina. Sabrina, did you want to ask the question? I think it would be good if you do, Sabrina. If we could ask the direct question, and then Fiona, over to you.
Thank you.
Hi, Fiona. Hi, everyone. I was just asking, what in this online sort of world, we're on the phone, we're online, etc. Rather than, I mean, I think everyone probably on this platform has had someone who's lost, lost a friend. I've lost a lot of people at work and things like that. How do you, what would you say is the best way to approach someone rather than say, how are you doing? Because I'm sure everyone says, how are you doing? I'm here if you want to talk. What in your experience is the best way to approach someone who's just experienced a big loss in a sensitive way when you can't actually be there or attend the funeral, or normally we do lots of hugs and everything else, so we can't go around for 9 nights, everything's online. It's really sort of desensitized everything. I was on a funeral yesterday online, and under 40, someone under 40 died. It was a massive online thing, but it just feels so unreal kind of thing. Although we're watching it just doesn't feel like you're there. So it's just, how do you approach those people, really, from your experience? Thank you.
Okay, that's a really big question. But thank you, Sabrina, because it is something, it's not just about me telling you about grief, it's also about how you support each other. And I'm definitely going to stick to the COVID thing, because it's so present with what's happening, and it certainly has impacted every aspect of our life, including how we communicate with each other. There is another element that doesn't come out until long afterwards for some people, and that is doubt, which contributes to a loss of self-confidence, which contributes to an inability to receive comfort. And the guilt and doubt is attached to COVID, as in some people actually question the death. They question themselves. Did they contribute? If they were caring for somebody, did they bring this in? If they, did they do enough for the person? Did they fight for the person? Should they have let them go to hospital? Should they have kept them? So many questions have been introduced into what is already, a deeply hurtful period of time. And how do you approach somebody in the midst of all of that without turning them upside down even more, because they're so sensitive? It's a very valid question. And all I can say is be honest, be open. Obviously, the type of relationship you have with a person will factor greatly into the depth of the conversation that you have. Because grievers are so sensitive, so emotional, they're supremely sensitive to other people. And if you're tentative in how you speak to them, then they're immediately going to react to that. Okay, what are they thinking? Are they thinking about, bad things about me? Am I not coping well? Am I doing things right? This is where the self-doubt and the self-guilt kicks in even more, because they have perceived an approach not to be what is meant. So, as I said, assess or judge, make a judgment of the type of relationship that you have with that person, and that will help you shape your words, whether it's just going to be a very gentle, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't know what it's like to experience that type of loss, but I know these are really awful times. It's something very honest, very simple, very straightforward is a very good opening to have, and allow the conversation to go where the person leads you. Because one thing that gets lost in the fog when you're trying to offer comfort is you make the mistake of overwhelming the person from your perspective. You need to consider what they need, and you only can get to that realization by asking them, by giving them the opening to state their needs. So you have to be very, and in the virtual world, it's not easy to read body language. So it's more about using open-ended questions. So you're not being very pointed in what you're saying. You're giving them a chance to respond to you. And as I said, expressing their needs, because it should be about their needs. What do they need? And how can you fulfill that need? Don't make any false promises is a key thing. You know, say what you mean and mean what you say.
Precisely.
That's
Fiona,
a start.
Can I just quickly ask you then, Fiona, let me ask the question the right way round. Is it a bad idea? I might know the answer to this question, but I'm just asking it publicly. Is it a bad idea to say to someone, I know how you feel?
Yes, it is. Because you are not that person. How could you know? And how we each feel at different points in time, regardless of the circumstances, is based on a whole welter of different things. And even if we go back to the child that we're carrying inside, you could never know about that from the outside looking in. So no, you don't know how I feel. So please don't go there.
Right.
And that tends to be very much the reaction from people. But unfortunately, they don't have the courage or the confidence to say so. And if they do, then they're seen as hostile or abrasive or, you know, negative. They're received negatively, which is really sad, because then people step back when that's the time now to step forward, apologize. Yes, you know, I can't know how you feel. Tell me, open up to me. I am here for you.
Yes.
Give them that invitation.
Yes.
Rather than create a barrier by giving them your framework.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fiona. Great question, Sabrina. Nicole, good morning to you. How are you this morning? Nicole's posted a question, and I think it's a great one. Nicole, would you be kind enough to ask Fiona?
Hi, Fiona.
I
was just wondering, during your grieving process or during one's grieving process, I think you might have answered part of the question already. How do we deal with that self-guilt? And as you were saying before, you might think you haven't done enough, should you have taken it? But how do we actually deal with that self-guilt? Because I know it was something that I actually experienced. So how do you... yeah.
Right. Well, very good question. Very big topic. Guilt is a very powerful thing. And the worst thing about guilt is it's self-imposed. And you very rarely will, if you put two groups of people beside each other, you will very, very rarely have one group asking the question of the other group that group is asking themselves. You know, guilt comes from within. Guilt is based on what you believe you have fell down on, where you believe you have failed. And very often there is no grounding for it, no foundation for it. When in the work, when I'm working with somebody and guilt is a very, very often a common theme, it needs to be challenged. You need to look for the evidence. You know, okay, so you think you're guilty, you feel guilty because this. Where's the evidence for it? What takes you there? What has happened to substantiate this belief? It is a self-imposed self-belief, and with all beliefs, there has to be some underpinning of truth. And if you can't find the truth to support the feeling, the sense of guilt, or the idea that's behind the guilt, then it's working your way forward to release yourself from that guilt. Again, giving yourself permission to be okay with the situation as it is. Another thing about guilt is it's about control. There is an element of control involved in imposing guilt on yourself. It's trying to manage the situation in a way that is satisfactory to you for whatever reason that is. And we're talking about guilt as a negative thing here. So if you're trying to satisfy something in a negative light, then that's an internal mechanism gone wrong there for whatever reason. That I would want to suggest very strongly belongs to the inner child, the injured child. And as I said, hurt people, even if it's you hurting yourself, because there has to be some layer of justification at some level that supports your belief of yourself as being incapable, not worthy, not doubtful, just not having the confidence and not having the self-esteem that and sense of self-worth that is yours by right, that was taken away from such an early age. But it comes out in so many different ways, and it takes a lot of exploration to allow us, when we're working together, to get down to the root of why are you in this place of guilt? What's the beginning of it? And how do you release it? And forgive yourself, not just for what you believe you have done, but for what was done for you, to you, that you had no control over, which is why you're trying to control now. I hope I didn't confuse you with that. Thank you, Ricky.
Brilliant question and wonderful answer, Fiona. Thank you so much. So just to bring this back into the arena, that grief is not just necessarily as a result of death. It could be, you could be a sports person, a young footballer in the Premier League, and you get injured and you can't play football again. That's horrific grief. Horrific. And loss. And it could be an accident where you may have lost a limb. It could be sickness. It could be you didn't get the job you wanted.
Yeah.
You know, relationship breakdown. To be ill with COVID. And your opportunities seem to have shrunk. That's grief.
Yeah.
So with all of that said and done, there is a question here. It's a bit of it's a heavier question, Fiona, and it's I believe it's geared to you. Let me go back to the chat. Yes, it's from Charlotte, I believe it is. I'm not sure if that's Charlotte or Charlotte, but it says, can you talk about the loss of your parents at a young age? My husband was aged 20 and 31. He's now 41. He also lost his only cousin when he was 15, all related to cancer. How does someone manage in that situation, Fiona? What can they do? You've talked a lot about grief. You've talked about managing it. You've talked about the emotions. But specifically, is there a pointer that maybe he could start with today to get back on the track?
Right. So my starting point for, is it Charlotte? Is that the right pronunciation? Thanks for the question. My starting point would be the earliest loss. And primarily because it's the first one, it's a significant loss, but also because of the age that he was at. And I would begin with a question around, was that acknowledged? Was his grief acknowledged back then? It's not too late if it wasn't, but it is a very good starting point to consider that not grieving for the loss of his cousin, not grieving at the age of 15, would leave him ill-equipped to be able to recognize and acknowledge the grief for the loss of his parents. And as I've said, each loss is different. Each loss has to be grieved in its own right. But grieving one loss does kind of equip you, strengthen you with the knowledge and with the facilities to work through other griefs. At age 15, however, at that particular developmental stage, it's not just a matter of straightforward grief. It's also how you grieve that matter as a young person, and not being able to have that recognized and have that process developed. That's the word I'm looking for. Have that processed and developed at that stage of life will leave you wanting for more as you get older. So my suggestion is that absolutely we need to go back to move forward. It's the only way for him. And it takes a lot of work. It takes some commitment. It takes some engagement. There is a theory on that Warden has put forward called TEAR, a model of grief. And he speaks to the tasks of grief. And what I would encourage your husband, if I were working with him, or, in the process of working with him, would encourage him to engage with the tasks of grief, as in to accept the reality of his loss and his losses, to experience the pain. That is the thing that most people are running from. And if at 15 you've experienced pain, yes, you might not ever want to go there again, but the pain you feel at 15 is not the same pain you're going to feel at 30. But the memory is going to keep it at bay, especially if you weren't taught, you didn't learn how to handle it, how to manage it yourself and the pain. There's also adjust to your life without the person that has died, and reinvest in what now is a new reality for you, an inescapable reality for you. Many people, when they're young, experience a loss of not just the person, but it's a loss of sense of self. As I've said before, it's you ask questions of yourself. Am I doing the right thing? Am I okay? Is everybody, at a young age, it's even going to be, is everybody laughing at me? Does everybody know? Do I want people to know? All of these kind of questions are going to raise their ugly head. And at age 15, if you've been carrying these feelings around, these questions in your head around, without any answers, they're very much going to be present in a little tight nugget deep inside at age 30, and will definitely hinder how you receive the deaths of your parents, who are your anchors in life. Now you're cast adrift. You couldn't rely on yourself before. Now you don't have them to rely on. Where do you go? What do you do?
Wow. Fascinating. Fiona, at some point in this session, I would love you to post your details so that I know people would want to get in touch with you, and you could put up your practice if you can, please, because I know you're busy and I know you're inundated, but people need some answers and some help, and you've been so supportive, even in just communicating, just as you have done this morning. There was a question that made me go wow, because I read deeper into the question, and the question was from Esther, and she was asking if there was any supportive agencies out there to support adopted children with loss. And I just thought of the complexity of a child whose parents may be alive, who they don't know, and there's that sense of loss. Again, Fiona, if you do know of any agencies, if you could just post them, or if you deal with that sort of thing, or you could refer with conviction to someone else, please, if you could help Esther, because it's a great question, Esther. Thank you for posting that.
Yeah, it is. And Esther, I would definitely have to have a conversation with you about that, really. There's especially now, you know, whatever was in place no longer is. And that's a real problem. But yes, we can have a conversation. I will post my contact details in the chat. I have uh, I was working with a death cafe that sat on Saturdays, every other Saturday. I have withdrawn from that. I have now begun a bereavement group, which is very specific to grief. It's the death cafe covers all aspects of death, dying, and beyond. Whereas the bereavement space is specifically for grievers. So I will forward to Mike those details. That sits on Mondays. There was one last night, 7:30, and I am keeping that quite specific also to the Black community.
Brilliant. And ladies and gentlemen, please do tune into those sessions, because the nuggets of information, the wealth of, even if it's that psychological nudge to help you make a decision, to do the task, to go through that tier process, it will be fantastic and worth it. Just one more question before I go to Councillor Patrick. Also to highlight that Marcia has mentioned that Child Bereavement UK is an excellent charity. You can Google them, look them up, search Google for some of the support services that you need. Look into the references and the reviews, and, you know, shop around, because ultimately you need that support. Fiona, the feedback so far has been excellent. We appreciate your wisdom and the sensitivity of the subject matter. And the honesty in the room. I think one of the starting points, Fiona, was the T in the TIER acronym, the tasks, because I think wherever we're at, whatever the issues are, whether it be brokenness from when we were a child, or to loss of a job or a loved one, we need to start with that T. So could you just tell us again, Fiona, what the T stands for? And that's where we'll start today. We'll start observing the tasks.
The T in TIER is to essentially to acknowledge your loss, to recognize the pain of your loss, to recognize that not only have you had a loss, but it's going to come with pain, and to let that pain happen, because it's the reality. Sorry, the reality, and they're one and the same. And you wouldn't have that pain if you didn't have a relationship with the person that you've lost, or the event, the loss event. It's rooted in the relationship that you have. And as much as different people will experience their pain differently, or acknowledge their pain in different ways, the core thing to remember is it's going to come with pain. But pain can be a part of healing. Pain is, if we go for biblical terms, pain is a fire that we walk through, you know, to be refined. It is part and parcel of the process of growth. We have growing pains. Why can we accept that we have, you know, this thing called growing pains that medicals don't necessarily acknowledge? But it's so much a part of our makeup that as we grow physically, you experience pain and imbalances. It is exactly the same with emotional pain. And we have to allow ourselves to grow. So rather than working around it, looking for ways to avoid it, trying to call it different names, we accept it as a reality, as our reality in this moment, and allow ourselves to step into the path of the fire and begin to grow through change. Also, while I'm talking, I want to appreciate Councillor Patrick for what he said, what he shared. It really does make a difference when you have somebody sharing your grief. Your experiences are different, your process of grief is different, but the loss is the same. And when you can share that, even as you said, Mike, just to hold your hand all the way through, you don't even have to find words. Somebody's asking the question of how do you, speak to somebody. Sometimes you don't need to use words, you just need to be present for the person, be there in a very real way. And it matters greatly, because you're saying to that person, you matter enough to me that you are here and I need to be here with you for as long as you will allow me, because it is going to be on their terms. I have to add that in. And it does help kind of cut through that fog of self-doubt and a real sense of loss of worth, because the person who gave you value is no longer here. So by letting other people know, by letting another person in that will allow them to feel worthy, that's a way of helping them in unimaginable ways.
It's powerful, powerful stuff. Thank you, Fiona. So we're going to start today by just doing that assessment, acknowledging the event. It's happened, acknowledging how you're feeling around the event. I tell you what, growing up where I grew up in Tooting, for those of you who know Tooting, South London, it was a hard space to grow up in. It was a hard space. There was a program on TV back then called Citizen Smith, where there was a racist and he used to chant Tooting. And black communities and Asian communities had to hold your own. So if something traumatic happened, you had to big up yourself, lift up your head, act like nothing's wrong, and keep going. Whatever the loss is, you had to keep going. But how much damage does that do by just fronting it and pretending nothing's happened and thinking I'm all right? And I'm going to say this, a lot of black men were taught not to cry. Am I right? Lots of black men were told, stop crying. You want something to cry for? We were told to not cry. So it was held in. How much trauma is taking place internally? Because we think we're coping, when really we're not facing the reality of loss.
Yeah.
We're disguising it.
Absolutely.
So go ahead, Fiona, help me on that one. I think you know exactly what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely agreeing with you. Again, it comes down to the cultural element, traditions of the past, which I probably have swung too far on the other side now. But yeah, there is this age-old concept that children should be a certain way rather than just be real. They were never given the space to be who they were. And feelings was something that never came into it, because feelings interfered with carrying on. As in, the mother needs to carry on with raising the children because the father isn't there. And life is just too hard to accommodate emotions and feelings and tears. And that filters down, that has filtered down through many, many generations, unfortunately. And one of the things we haven't touched on, which is another topic on its own, is left behind children, which Mike knows is very dear to my heart. The injuries that are delivered on children who didn't grow up connected to their parents, and then have to be, playing catch up at an older age. Grievous injuries. Unfortunately, sometimes though, now we wear this thing, I'm broken, as a badge of honor. And it's used as a platform, not necessarily in a positive way. I do want to encourage you to acknowledge your brokenness. We are all broken, every last one of us. is broken in some way. And for some of us, just more than others and younger than others. And it's something that should unite us, as in we support each other. And as Mike touched on, it releases the judgment element rather than be used against one another. We can be broken together and still be strong, still be, still find a way to move forward with a unified front and find a way to heal each other and ourselves. But first, you have to acknowledge the reality that you are broken. You have been broken, but you can heal. You just have to not work it through. Just begin the process.
Powerful stuff. Fiona, that's been great. It does remind me of this Japanese art, kintsugi. I can never really say that word properly. Kintsugi, kintsugi, I suppose. Where they take a broken vessel, something that was precious, it might have been a vase, and someone knocks it off the shelf with their elbow or whatever, and it breaks. And they build it back together, but put gold as the glue.
Yeah.
And so the repaired piece is worth more than the original. But you see the brokenness, but then it becomes complete. And that kind of reminds us of how we are as humans. We're applying this gold to the broken pieces of our life, but we still see the brokenness because we always have a memory. But when we see the final version, we say, wow, it's fit for the table. It's fit for the shelf again. It's actually a good piece. And I'd like us to get to that part where we take our broken pieces, we do that assessment, and we take the time with therapists and places like this, self-help, professional help. Some of you pray, some of you seek counsel, whatever it is, whatever that gold is that's going to help bring that broken pieces back together and make it a beautiful vessel. That's what we need to do. But we must acknowledge that it's broken. Then we can fix it. All right? I think there's hope for us all. Am I right, Fiona? Is there hope?
Absolutely.
Are you sure?
Yes, because we didn't have this space if there wasn't hope. None of us would be here if we didn't have hope of some form. It is, a way forward. It's a way of getting an understanding. It's laying that foundation for us to launch ourselves from.
Yes.
So yes, there is hope.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fiona. Can everyone, please, who could hear Fiona today, can we just really celebrate her and let her know that she's doing a critical piece? We've clapped for the NHS. I think we can clap for Fiona. She is helping us through this difficult season. You're doing a mammoth job, and we want to make sure that we can support you in any way we can, all right? And to everyone else who, if you're feeling stressed, emotionally challenged, it's a good time to do an audit. Seek some help. Seek some help early. Don't let it completely crash. But if it has completely crashed, there is still hope, all right? So lift up our heads a little bit more. Take a bit of a peek into your future. Look in the rearview mirror of your life. Don't stare at that driving forward. It's just there for reference. See where we've been. But we're moving forward, all right? So we're going to strengthen ourselves. We're going to lift our heads up. Take a deep breath. And start with the T in the tier, the tasks. We're going to start with those. But the only thing I'm going to really encourage you to do is to be kind to yourself as you do your assessment. No space for beating yourself up today. The world's trying to beat you up anyway. There's enough of that going on. We don't want you turning on yourself, all right?